Goodfellas follows one crew across a few blocks of Brooklyn and Queens, and for more than 30 years, it has been the most loved gangster film ever made. What the camera never showed was the structure sitting above that crew. The men who gave the orders, collected the tribute, and decided who lived. A number of them are still alive. They are old now, some in wheelchairs, some in prison medical wards, and they remain locked away. The official boss of the very family the film was built around has been in a cell since 1992, and more than 3 decades later he is still listed as the boss, reportedly still sending instructions out of prison on folded scraps of paper. A boss from Chicago sits inside the most secure prison in the country. 3 godfathers from the old country are sealed under a system built to erase them from the world outside. This is the chain of command the camera never climbed. Section 1. Vittorio Amuso. The boss, still in the chair. The story Goodfellas tells runs out in 1980, in a quiet suburban house, with a former associate in a bathrobe complaining about the rest of his life. The family that story belonged to did not run out. The Lucchese organization, the crew on Pine Street, the cab stand, the airport rackets, all of it sat at the very bottom of a structure that kept climbing long after Henry Hill stopped talking. The camera never followed it up. It stayed on the street, with the men who parked the cars and hijacked the trucks and ran the books, and it never once showed the chair at the top of the whole arrangement. That chair has an occupant today. He has held it since the early part of 1992, and he has held it from inside a federal cell. His name is Vittorio Amuso, known for most of his life as Little Vic. He was born on November 4, 1934, in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, a few miles and 1 generation removed from the world the film would later put on screen. According to the sources that have traced his early years, he grew up surrounded by the local crews at the height of their reach, and he attached himself young to a capo regime, a crew captain, named Christopher Fernari, who ran an operation out of a Brooklyn social club. Amuso learned the work the way most of them did, from the bottom, through collections and gambling and patience. What people who knew him remembered most was how little he said. He climbed quietly, over decades, and for a long time almost no one outside the family had any reason to know his name. During the years the film actually covers, the Lucchese family had its own bosses, men who sat far above the capo regime the movie renamed Paulie. Vario answered up that chain to figures the camera never introduced. By the middle of the 1980s, that chain broke at the top. A sweeping federal case against the heads of the New York families, built around the secret ruling body the organizations used to settle their largest disputes, took down the Lucchese leadership in a single stroke. The boss, his second-in-command, and his counselor were convicted and sentenced to terms that guaranteed none of them would walk free again. The seat at the top of the family was suddenly empty, and someone had to fill it. The way the sources tell it, the outgoing boss summoned 2 men in 1986 to discuss who would inherit the family. One of them was Amuso, the other was a younger and more openly violent figure named Anthony Casso, remembered on the street as Gaspipe. When the meeting was over, Amuso was the new boss of the Lucchese family, with Casso serving beneath him. What followed was one of the bloodiest stretches any American Mafia family has ever put itself through, and almost all of the blood belonged to its own members. Amuso ran the family on suspicion. Anyone he believed had skimmed money talked to investigators, or simply grown too independent became a target, and the targets were frequently his own soldiers and captains. One member, a man named Michael Papadio, who had handled the family's interests in the garment trade, was lured to a meeting and beaten to death after Amuso came to believe he had been holding money back. He was one of many. A federal prosecutor who worked the case later described Amuso as the Deadly Dawn, and the description was not theater. By the government's count, he ordered around 9 murders and the attempts on several more lives during his years in charge. a purge severe enough that members of his own family began going to the authorities simply to survive him. The case that finally caught him did not come from a body. It came from a contract. In 1990, federal prosecutors indicted Amuso as part of a scheme to rig the bids on a contract to replace windows across the city's public housing. A quiet and enormously profitable racket that funneled money straight to the family's leadership. Rather than surrender, Amuso vanished. He spent close to a year as a fugitive on the federal most wanted list, while agents chased him across several states. In the summer of 1991, they caught up with him in Pennsylvania. His trial followed quickly, and in the early summer of 1992, only a couple of months after the government had secured the guilty plea that brought down the far more famous John Gotti, Amuso was convicted of murder and racketeering. He was sentenced to life. One account measured the full term at 455 years. Most bosses, at that point, fade. Amuso did not. From a cell he held onto the title for decade after decade, and the family kept treating his word as final. The clearest picture of how that worked came from a former Lucchese soldier named John Panisi, who left the life and testified about it in court. By his account, Amuso reached out from prison with a written order telling the family's acting boss to step aside and hand control to a new man of Amuso's choosing, and the order carried the weight of a threat against anyone who resisted, including a list of names. Prosecutors have argued for years that Amuso never stopped running the Lucchese family from behind the walls. Amuso has denied it. The denials have not changed how the family behaved. He is 91 years old now, held at the Federal Medical Complex at Butner in North Carolina. In the summer of 2023, his lawyers asked a judge to release him early, describing a man confined to a wheelchair, his arthritis crippling, his eyesight failing, his teeth gone. A man, they said, was no longer a danger to anyone. The judge refused. He ruled that the scale of the blood's head behind Amuso, the years of murder used as a simple business tool, were too serious to allow any early end to the sentence. And so he remains where he has been since the cameras that would make his family famous had not yet rolled. The film stopped at the neighborhood and never climbed to this chair. The man in it has now sat there, out of public view, for longer than the entire span of years Goodfellas put on screen. Amuso took the top chair just as the cell door was closing, and he has held it from the inside ever since. The man he needed on the street, the one who kept the money moving through concrete and steel for the next generation of the family, was his underboss. Next is Stephen Crea, and the empire he built out of construction. Section 2. Stephen Crea and the mob tax on a city. Every tower that goes up in New York rises on the same handful of things. Concrete poured by union crews, steel set by union crews, windows hung, drywall raised, elevators dropped down their shafts, sidewalk sheds bolted into place. For a long stretch of the late 20th century, a portion of the money from all of that work bent quietly toward the five families. And inside the Lucchese organization, the man who understood that side of the business better than anyone was its underboss. The film made the family's income look like hijacked trucks and stolen cigarettes. The larger fortune of the later family came out of the ground, out of foundations and scaffolding and labor contracts, and the man who pulled it up was named Stephen Crea. He was born on July 18, 1947, in the Bronx. And he came up inside the family's Bronx crews rather than the Brooklyn and Queens world the movie made famous. The street gave him a nickname that followed him for the rest of his life. They called him Wonder Boy, and sometimes Stevie Wonder, a name that started as a small joke about how smoothly things seemed to go for him, and hardened over the years into something closer to respect. He was inducted in the 1980s, and rose steadily. And what set him apart was not violence for its own sake. It was that he could run a business, a real one, with permits and payrolls and bid sheets, and bend it without breaking it. The business he ran was construction. In plain terms, The family inserted itself between the people who wanted to put up a building and the work required to do it. Through control over certain unions and certain supply companies, the organization could decide which contractors got hired, which jobs ran smoothly, and which sites suddenly developed labor problems that no one could explain. A contractor who paid was a contractor whose project stayed on schedule. A contractor who refused found his deliveries late and his crews walking off. By the 1990s, Korea was at the center of an operation the sources describe as the Lucchese Construction Group, a structure that organized this corruption across the city. The effect reached far past the family itself. By one estimate, the grip these crews held over the building trades raised the cost of construction across New York by around 5%. A hidden surcharge passed down through every project and paid in the end by people who had no idea it existed. They had built a tax on the skyline, and they collected it without a single line item ever appearing on a bill. The law reached him for the first time in a serious way in 2004, when he was convicted on corruption charges tied to those same construction rackets. The sentence ran to a little under 3 years. It removed him from the street for a stretch, and it did almost nothing to slow the family's plans for him. When he came out, he resumed his climb, and from around the turn of the century through his arrest in 2017, he functioned as the official underboss of the Lucchese family, the second in command on the street, while the man at the very top sat in a federal cell hundreds of miles away. For more than a decade, Korea was as close to the day-to-day running of the family as anyone walking free. What ended it was a killing, in 2013, of a Bronx figure named Michael Meldish, a man who had once worked alongside the family and then defied its leadership over money. Korea helped orchestrate that murder, and the full shape of it, the reason it happened, and the way it was carried out, belongs to the next section. What matters here is what it cost him. The case that grew out of that single body did not only reach Korea, it reached his son, Stephen D. Korea, who held the rank of captain and who was convicted of conspiracy in the same matter and sentenced to 13 years. The father had built a life designed to keep the family's hands clean and its money quiet, and in the end, the one act of blood pulled both him and his son into the same net. The arrests came in the spring of 2017, when federal agents took down around a dozen made men, along with associates across the family in a single morning. Korea was among them, named in the indictment as the underboss. The trial that followed ran 6 weeks in a courtroom north of the city, before a federal judge named Kathy Seibel, and on November 15, 2019, exactly 6 years to the day after Meldish was killed, the jury convicted Korea and his co-defendants. The sentencing came the following summer. On August 27, 2020, Korea was sentenced to life in prison, ordered to pay a fine of $400,000, and ordered to forfeit $1 million more. He was the last of the group arrested in 2017 to be sentenced, the final figure in one of the largest organized crime cases the district had ever brought. The prosecutor framed the moment as a closing of the book on the family. The book has stayed closed less neatly than that. But for Korea personally, there was no ambiguity left. He is 78 years old now. In the spring of 2024, according to reporting that covers the family closely, Korea was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer that had already spread, and his lawyers began the same kind of petition his old boss had filed, asking the courts to let a dying man finish his time outside the walls. He remains, as of the most recent accounting, inside the federal system, in the same vast network of prisons that holds the boss he served. The man who spent his life making sure the family's money looked like ordinary commerce, who turned scaffolding and union halls into a quiet fortune, who raised the cost of building an entire city by a few invisible points, is set to die in a cell for the one killing that could not be made to look like anything other than what it was. The Wonder Boy nickname has outlived almost everything it once described. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Crea helped set the killing of Michael Meldish in motion, but he was not the man who gave the order. That came from higher up, from the acting boss running the family's daily affairs. Next is Matthew Madonna, and the full story of the murder that brought the whole leadership down. Section 3. Matthew Madonna and the murder that sank the family. On the evening of November 15, 2013, a car sat at the wheel of a quiet street in the Throgs Neck section of the Bronx, with its engine still running, and a man slumped behind the glass. Michael Meldish had been shot once in the head at close range, an execution carried out in a residential neighborhood as if it were routine. For a city that had been told for years that the Mafia was finished, it was a jarring sight, a contract killing in the modern Bronx with no robbery, no struggle, and no apparent reason visible from the street. The order behind it traced back to one of the oldest working bosses in New York, a man whose life in crime had begun more than half a century before the trigger was pulled. Matthew Madonna was born on November 2, 1935, in New York City, and the sources that follow the family place the start of his criminal career in the 1950s. In 1959, while serving time in a state prison upstate, he met a young drug dealer from Harlem named Nicky Barnes, who would go on to become one of the most notorious narcotics figures in the city. The two built an operation together. By the account that has circulated for decades, Madonna would leave a car loaded with heroin in a Manhattan parking lot. Barnes would collect it, distribute the product, and return the same car filled with cash. The arrangement ran until Madonna's arrest in the mid-1970s, which ended with a 30-year sentence for drug trafficking. He served around 20 years of it. A man who has spent 20 years in federal prison usually comes home to nothing. Madonna came home to a promotion. In the late 1990s, the family inducted him as a reward for his silence and his usefulness, and he rose quickly through the ranks, first to captain, and then onto a small ruling panel that governed the family alongside other senior figures. By around 2009, he was functioning as the acting boss, the man running daily affairs on the street, while the official boss sat in a cell. He had outlasted almost everyone from his own generation, and he ran the family with the authority of someone who had paid for his rank with 2 decades of his life. The organization he oversaw in those years looked far more like a business than a street gang. Its money came from gambling rings that stretched into New Jersey, from loan sharking, and from the construction fraud that ran underneath major building projects across the city, including, according to the later indictment, a multi-million-dollar hospital expansion. Madonna sat at the top of all of it, collecting the money that flowed upward and answering for the decisions that kept it flowing. One of those decisions ended a life. Michael Meldish was no innocent. For years, he had led a Bronx crew known as the East Harlem Purple Gang, a group of drug dealers and killers active across the Bronx and Upper Manhattan in the 1970s and 1980s, and he had spent his life as a violent enforcer and debt collector who worked alongside the family rather than inside it. What turned him into a target was defiance. Meldish had refused to collect a debt owed to Madonna, a small act of insubordination that, inside the logic of the organization, could not be allowed to stand. A boss whose orders could be ignored was no longer a boss. For that refusal, in the autumn of 2013, Madonna ordered him killed. The killing was divided among ranks the way the work always was. Prosecutors laid it out in plain terms after the convictions came down. Madonna gave the order. A soldier named Christopher Londonio set the murder up. An associate named Terrence Caldwell pulled the trigger. The underboss, Stephen Crea, and his son were also charged with helping to order it. Meldish was shot at the wheel of his own car and left there. Londonio would later add a strange footnote to the case when prosecutors accused him of plotting to escape from jail by losing enough weight to slip his restraints, a scheme that left him noticeably thinner by the time he reached trial. The reckoning came in the spring of 2017, when federal agents swept up around a dozen made men across the family. Madonna was 81 years old by then, and already sitting in a New Jersey jail on separate state charges when he was transferred into federal custody. The trial ran 6 weeks before a federal judge north of the city, and on November 15, 2019, exactly 6 years to the day after Meldish was shot, the jury returned guilty verdicts against Madonna and his co-defendants. The sentencing followed the next summer. Madonna, by then 84, was sentenced to life in prison. He used his moment before the court to insist he was innocent and had conspired with no one. The judge was unmoved, describing him as the acting head of a murderous organization that had terrorized its community and profited from every part of it. He is 90 years old now, and as far as the available records show, he remains in federal prison, serving a sentence that will end only one way. His life in the rackets ran from the era of black and white television to a contract killing carried out in 2013, a span so long that he was already an old man building heroin networks before most of the figures in Goodfellas had reached the height of their careers. The film left audiences with the comfortable sense that all of this belonged to a closed chapter of the past, a world of trucks and nightclubs that had long since faded. Madonna was proof of how wrong that sense was. The structure never stopped. It simply grew older, quieter, and more careful, until an 80-year-old man in charge of it signed off on a murder over an unpaid debt and pulled the entire leadership of his family down into prison alongside him. Madonna ran the family until an old grievance and a single order ended everything he had built. The next man held the same kind of power in a different family, and the government decided he was so dangerous that they buried him in the most isolating prison in America. Next is Vincent Basciano, the Bonanno boss they put in the hole. Section 4. Vincent Basciano, the boss they buried alive. In a stretch of the Bronx, in the early 2000s, there was a beauty salon called Hello Gorgeous, and the man who owned it cared a great deal about how he looked. His hair was always perfect. His clothes were pressed and expensive. Even years later, after he had been locked away in conditions designed to strip a person of everything, reporters in the courtroom noted that he still managed to appear immaculately groomed, as if the cell had no claim on his vanity. The street called him Vinny Gorgeous, and the name fit so well it sounded invented. Today, the owner of that salon sits inside the federal prison system, serving 2 life sentences. And for more than a decade, he was held in the single most isolating cell the United States government operates. Vincent Basciano was born on November 14, 1959, in the Bronx, and he came into the Bonanno crime family the way most made men did, through a local crew. He was inducted around 1991 and served under a captain known on the street as Patty from the Bronx, and he climbed through gambling, extortion, and the ordinary machinery of the family until he was close to the top. His rise accelerated for a grim reason. In 2004, the Bonanno boss, Joseph Massino, was arrested and put on trial, and with the leadership in chaos, Basciano stepped in as acting boss of the family. What happened next broke the one rule the movies always treat as sacred. Joseph Massino, the official boss of an entire New York family, decided to cooperate with the government. He became the highest-ranking member of the 5 families ever to take the witness stand against his own people. And he did more than testify in general terms. While both men were behind bars, Massino agreed to wear a recording device and draw Basciano into conversation, capturing his acting boss discussing a murder on tape. It was the first time in the history of the American Mafia that a sitting boss had recorded and testified against one of his own underlings. The code of silence the film built its whole moral world around. The omertà that supposedly bound these men to the grave collapsed at the very highest level of the organization, and Basciano was the man left standing in the wreckage of it. The murder on those recordings was the killing of a Bonanno associate named Randolph Pizzolo, shot dead in 2004 on Basciano's order as he moved to cement his control of the family. The case went to trial in 2011 as a capital matter, meaning the government asked the jury to sentence Basciano to death. The jury convicted him of the murder, but spared his life. Reaching its decision in the penalty phase in under 2 hours, he received a second life term, stacked on top of a life sentence he had already been given in 2008 for earlier crimes. 2 lifetimes of punishment for a man who would never see a release date under either one. Between those 2 convictions came the detail that defined how he would actually serve his time. In 2006, Basciano passed a handwritten list to another inmate. On it were the names of the federal judge in his case, the prosecutor, and a cooperating witness. The government read it as a hit list, evidence that even from a cell he intended to have the people building the case against him killed. Basciano told a different story. He said he practiced Santeria, a faith that blends Catholic and West African traditions, and that the list had been handed off so the names could be used in a curse meant to ruin his enemies before trial, not to mark them for death. The courts did not take the chance. Whatever the list was truly for, it landed him in solitary confinement at the federal supermax in Florence, Colorado, for around 11 years, under restrictions normally reserved for convicted terrorists. The men housed in that part of the system included the Unabomber and a figure convicted in the first bombing of the World Trade Center. A former warden once described the place as a cleaner version of hell. That was where the salon owner from the Bronx spent more than a decade of his Hav. Life, mostly alone, in a concrete room. His lawyers fought it the entire way. They argued the hit list theory was a tactic meant to isolate him and pressure him into cooperating, and they insisted he had endured the years in the hole because he refused to break and refused to inform. At one point, Basciano filed an affidavit of poverty, telling the court he was broke and asking taxpayers to fund his appeal, a request that captured how completely his world had shrunk. As recently as the start of 2026, reporting indicated he had finally been moved out of the Colorado Supermax to a penitentiary in eastern Kentucky, a transfer that came only after prosecutors concluded he no longer posed the kind of threat that had justified burying him in the first place. After all those years, the government decided the man was simply old and let him be moved to a slightly less total form of confinement. The story sits at an odd angle to everything the film taught audiences to expect. Goodfellas sold a world where these men lived by a code, where loyalty held and silence was sacred, where a boss was untouchable and an informant was the lowest thing alive. Basciano lived the opposite of that legend. He was undone by the testimony of his own boss, recorded by the highest figure in his family, and the structure that was supposed to protect him handed him over without hesitation the moment cooperation became the smarter move. The vanity survived. The empire did not. The man who could not bear to leave the house with his hair out of place will spend whatever remains of his life in a cell, twice over, with no door at the end of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Basciano fell because the men around him turned, one by one, until even the boss above him was wearing a wire. The next family did not lose its leadership one figure at a time. The government took the entire administration in a single morning. Next is the Colombo family, and the day the feds arrested the whole top of the house at once. Section 5. The Colombo family. And the morning, they took the whole house. On a single morning in September of 2021, federal agents fanned out across New York and arrested almost the entire leadership of the Colombo crime family at once. The boss, the underboss, the counselor, multiple captains, a soldier. In one coordinated sweep, the government did something it rarely manages to do, which is to take the complete administration of a mafia family off the street in a single stroke before any of them had the chance to fill the holes the arrests left behind. Where the other families unraveled slowly, one informant and one indictment at a time, The Colombo family was decapitated in an afternoon. The family had carried the same name at its center for half a century. Carmine Persico, known as the Snake, ran the Colombo organization for roughly 30 years, and he ran most of it from inside a prison cell, issuing orders through visitors and intermediaries, while serving a sentence that kept him locked away until his death in 2019. A boss who governs a criminal family from the inside of a federal penitentiary should have been a warning. Instead, it became a tradition. When the government identified the man it believed was next in line to take over the family, the name was familiar: Theodore Persico Jr. Known as Skinny Teddy, was the Snake's nephew, and the bloodline that had produced a boss who ruled from prison was now offering up its heir. Persico Jr. had already paid the kind of price the life demands. Back in 1993, during one of the family's internal wars, he was released on a brief furlough to attend his grandmother's wake, and while he was out, he passed an order to his crew to kill a member of a rival faction named Joseph Scopo. He pleaded guilty to a murder conspiracy charge years later and served a 10-year sentence, walking free on supervised release in the spring of 2020. According to the government, his time at the top of the family was meant to begin the moment that supervision ended. He was the boss in waiting, the figure the family had chosen to carry the name forward. What pulled him and everyone above him into the net was a scheme as old as the family itself. For years, under the direction of the sitting boss, Andrew Russo, the Colombo family had been working its way into a labor union based in Queens and draining the healthcare fund that was supposed to provide medical benefits to the union's working members. They extorted a senior union official for a steady cut. They steered the fund's contracts toward companies tied to the mob in exchange for kickbacks. They laundered the proceeds and ran loan sharking on the side. The target was not some abstract corporation. It was the medical fund of ordinary union workers, the money set aside to cover their doctors and their prescriptions. And the family treated it as a private account to be skimmed. The recordings the government gathered captured how the work actually sounded. One of the captains, Vincent Ricardo, known on the street as Vinny Unions, was caught on tape threatening the life of the union official they were squeezing. He explained, in effect, that the man would keep obeying because the man understood that Ricardo would put him in the ground if he did not. There was no charm in it, none of the warmth the film draped over its gangsters. It was a flat promise of murder, used as a collection tool. Ricardo had been in custody from the day of the 2021 arrests, and he was eventually sentenced to a little over 4 years. The full indictment named 14 people, and the roster read like an organizational chart of the entire family. Russo at the top as boss. Benjamin Castellazzo, an old man in his 80s, as underboss. Ralph Di Matteo as consigliere. Persico Jr., Ricardo, and another figure named Richard Ferrara as captains. When the guilty pleas came down across the following 2 years, the prosecutor leading the case described the result plainly, saying the family had been decapitated by the convictions of its leadership. Andrew Russo never saw the end of it. He died in the spring of 2022 at the age of 87, while the case was still working its way through the courts, the boss going to his grave with the prosecution unfinished. Persico Jr. pleaded guilty in 2023. The man who was supposed to inherit the throne went to prison instead of taking it. The shape of the story says something about how far the world has drifted from the one the film preserved. Goodfellas never showed the Colombo family at all, never showed a union health fund being bled, never showed the slow, grinding bureaucracy of a modern racketeering case. It showed hijacked trucks, and quick scores, and men who lived and died by a personal code. The reality, decades on, was an aging crew running the same union shakedowns their fathers had run, recorded by federal wires, and swept up, not through the betrayal of a single frightened informant, but through a methodical investigation that ended with the government simply arresting everyone at the top on the same day. The Persico name had survived a boss ruling from a cell. It could not survive the air being locked in one before he ever sat down at the head of the table. The throne the family had spent years preparing for him sits empty, and the man meant to fill it is counting his years behind bars like the uncle before him. The Colombo family ran its rackets in the same city the film called home, which is why audiences could at least imagine it. The next boss operated 1,000 miles away, in a city Goodfellas never touched, and the murders that put him away were turned into a different Scorsese film entirely. Next is Chicago, James Marcello, and the killings behind Casino. Section 6, James Marcello, the outfit boss behind the casino murders. In June of 1986, investigators dug into a cornfield in rural Indiana and pulled 2 badly beaten bodies out of the ground. They belonged to brothers. Anthony Spilotro, known on the street as Tony the Ant, had been the Chicago mob's man in Las Vegas for more than a decade, the figure who watched over the casino skim and ran the muscle in the desert. His brother Michael had been killed alongside him. The two had been lured to a house in suburban Chicago, beaten to death in a basement, and buried far from the city in a field where no one was meant to find them. Years later, a filmmaker would restage that killing for the screen, turning it into one of the most disturbing scenes in American crime cinema. The man who delivered the brothers to their deaths is alive today, sealed inside the most secure prison the United States operates. Goodfellas was a New York story from beginning to end. It never crossed into Chicago, and Chicago was its own world. The organization there did not call itself a family. They called it the Outfit, a single centralized operation that controlled the city's rackets with a discipline and reach that arguably made it more powerful than any of the 5 New York families. The film never showed it, never named it, never gestured toward the men who ran it. One of those men was James Martello, known as Little Jimmy and also as Jimmy the Man, who sat as the boss of the Chicago Outfit through the early years of the 2000s. The Spilotro killings were the murders that would eventually define him. Tony Spilotro had drawn an enormous amount of heat onto the Outfit during his years in Las Vegas, running burglary crews, attracting federal attention, and becoming a liability the organization could no longer carry. The decision was made to remove him and his brother both. In the standard method of the life, the brothers were brought to their deaths by someone they trusted. Marcello drove them. He picked them up, kept them calm, and delivered them to the house in Bensonville, where the crew was waiting to beat them to death. It was a betrayal dressed up as an ordinary ride, and it worked exactly as designed. The reason most people know this story at all is that Martin Scorsese, the same director who made Goodfellas, turned it into a film. In Casino, the Spilotro figure is beaten with baseball bats in a cornfield and buried while still breathing, and the role was played by Joe Pesci, the same actor who had played the volatile killer in Goodfellas 5 years earlier. Audiences have watched a version of this murder for 30 years. What they never saw was the boss who ordered the brothers brought to that basement, or the man behind the wheel of the car that carried them there. He stayed off every screen. He is sitting in a cell in Colorado right now. What finally brought Marcello and the leadership of the Outfit to trial was a betrayal from inside their own bloodlines. The federal case was called Operation Family Secrets, and the name was earned. It was built on the cooperation of the Outfit's own. The son of one of the most feared killers in the organization agreed to wear a wire against his father, and a brother who had personally committed many murders for the Outfit agreed to testify about all of them. Decades of unsolved killings were suddenly back on the table. The investigation also reached back into Marcello's earlier years behind bars, when he had been serving a previous sentence and had continued running Outfit business through his brother, who visited him in prison while federal agents quietly recorded the conversations. The man had governed the organization from a cell once already. Long before the cell became permanent, the trial in 2007 brought more than 100 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence before the jury, and when it was over, all 5 defendants were convicted of racketeering. 4 of them, Marcello included, were sentenced to spend the rest of their lives in prison. Marcello's conviction carried the weight of the Spilotro murders along with it. He was sent to the federal supermax at Florence, Colorado, the same fortress that has held the most dangerous prisoners in the country, and he remains there today as inmate within a system designed to ensure he never coordinates anything again. The men who went down with him did not last. Joseph Lombardo, the outfit consigliere who had testified in his own defense with a string of jokes, died in prison in 2019. Frank Calabrese, the South Side enforcer, whose own son had worn the wire, died behind bars in 2012. Marcello has outlived most of them. He is 82 years old now, described in court filings as the highest-ranking Chicago boss still alive in federal custody, and he has continued to file petitions trying to undo his sentence on legal technicalities. None have worked. There is no projected release date attached to his name, which is the bureaucratic way of saying he is expected to die where he is. The whole arc of it would have been unimaginable inside the world the film built. Goodfellas left audiences with the sense that the mob was a New York phenomenon, a thing of neighborhood crews and Sunday dinners that had run its course. 1,000 miles west, an entire parallel organization had been running the same kind of operation with greater control and a longer reach, and its boss ended up buried alive in a concrete cell, convicted of murders so notorious that another Scorsese film had already shown them to millions of people who never knew the real man's name. The camera found the killing. It never found the boss. He is still out there, in the only sense that counts, sitting alone in Colorado. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Marcello and the New York bosses all belong to the American branch of something that began somewhere else, entirely. The men who built the original, the godfathers of the Sicilian source, were more violent than anything the film imagined, and the survivors are sealed away under a prison system designed to erase them. Next is Sicily, and the Corleonesi boss who waged war on an entire nation. Section 7, Leoluca Bagarella and the War on a Nation. On a spring afternoon in May of 1992, a stretch of motorway outside Palermo erupted. Somewhere under the road, the Sicilian Mafia had packed hundreds of pounds of explosives. And when the convoy carrying Italy's most famous anti-mafia judge passed over it, a man on a nearby hillside pressed a button. The blast tore a crater into the highway and killed the judge, Giovanni Falcone, along with his wife and 3 of his bodyguards. This was not a gangland hit on a rival or an informant. It was an act of war against a national government, carried out in the open, designed to terrify an entire country into backing down. Nothing the American mob ever did came close to it. And the film that taught the world what the Mafia was supposed to look like never showed this side of it at all. One of the men who helped wage that war is alive today, sealed inside an Italian prison cell. His name is Leoluca Bagarella, and he was born in 1942 in the hill town of Corleone, the same small Sicilian town whose name a novelist would later borrow for a fictional godfather, and whose real clan would come to dominate the entire organization. Bagarella married into the heart of that power. His sister was the wife of Salvatore Riina, the man who became the boss of all the Sicilian bosses, and Bagarella served as one of Riina's most trusted and most violent enforcers. On the street and in the files, he was known as Don Lucino, a quiet honorific for a man who killed without hesitation. Blood ran through his family in both directions. One of his brothers was shot dead in a notorious gun massacre in Palermo at the end of the 1960s. Another was murdered while in prison a few years later. His wife, whom he married in 1991, while he was already deep in the life, took her own life in 1995 as the family's world collapsed around her, sinking into a depression after relatives turned informant and a child connected to the clan was killed. Bagarella had her body buried in secret on a hillside outside Palermo, and it was never recovered. The man lived surrounded by death, including the deaths of the people closest to him, and he kept killing anyway. The campaign that defines his place in history grew out of revenge. Through the 1980s, Italian prosecutors had built an enormous case against Cosa Nostra, and when the highest court in the country upheld those convictions in 1987, sentencing hundreds of mafiosi to long terms, the Corleonesi decided to answer with terror. They hunted down the prosecutors who had built the cases. Falcone was killed on the motorway in May. His colleague Paolo Borsellino was killed by a car bomb on a Palermo street weeks later. And after Retta himself was finally captured in early 1993, the remaining leadership carried the war onto the Italian mainland, setting off bombs in Rome, Florence, and Milan that killed ordinary civilians and damaged some of the country's most treasured historic buildings, including a world-famous art gallery. Bagarella was among the men directing that strategy of bombings, a deliberate effort to pressure the government into easing its crackdown and dismantling the harsh prison rules being prepared for captured bosses. They were trying to bomb a democracy into negotiating with them. His own record of killings stretched across decades. He was convicted of murdering a Palermo police chief at the end of the 1970s. He was named as one of the men who ordered the motorway massacre that killed Falcone. He was tied to the 1995 murder of a relative of one of the most important informants in Mafia history, and to many more deaths besides. After roughly 4 years as a fugitive, he was arrested in Palermo in June of 1995, given up by a collaborator who knew where to find him. What the Italian courts did with him afterward is the part that sets this story apart from every American case in this account. Bagarella was convicted of belonging to the Mafia and of a long list of murders, and he was sentenced not to 1 life term, but to 13 of them. Then he was placed under a special regime the Italian state had created precisely for men like him, known by the article of law that established it. Under that regime, a boss is cut off from the outside world almost completely. He is held in near total isolation. His mail is read and censored. His rare visits happen through a glass partition with the conversation recorded, and every aspect of his confinement is built to sever the invisible threads of command that bosses had always used to keep running their organizations from behind bars. Bagarella has lived under that regime for around 30 years, held in maximum security prisons including one on the island of Sardinia, much of that time spent entirely alone. A national accounting in 2025 counted several hundred men held under those conditions across the country. He is among the oldest and most infamous of them. The whole story reframes the world the film built. The American families that Goodfellas made famous were the children of this, transplanted to New York and Chicago and stripped down to neighborhood rackets and Sunday dinners. The original, the Sicilian source, was something far larger and far more brutal, an organization willing to assassinate judges, bomb cultural landmarks, and openly challenge the authority of a nation-state. The film showed the descendants. It never showed the fathers. And while the American bosses in this account sit in ordinary cells filing appeals, the Sicilian survivors of that war are sealed under a regime engineered to erase them from public life entirely. Bagarella, the brother-in-law and enforcer of the most powerful boss the Mafia ever produced, is one of the last men from that war still breathing. Locked away from the country he once tried to terrorize into surrender, Bagarella helped plan the war that moved onto the Italian mainland. But the man who actually directed the wave of bombings that struck Rome, Florence, and Milan was younger, sharper, and even more dangerous. Next is Giuseppe Graviano, the boss of Brancaccio, and the campaign of explosions he ran against his own country. Section 8. Giuseppe Graviano, the boss who bombed his own country. In September of 1993, a parish priest was shot dead outside his home in the Brancaccio quarter of Palermo. His name was Father Pino Puglisi, and his crime, in the eyes of the men who ran the neighborhood, was that he had spent years preaching against the Mafia from his pulpit and pulling local children away from the clan, before they could be recruited into it. He had built a center for young people. He had refused mob donations. He had told his parishioners that the men who ruled their streets were not protectors. For that, a gunman approached him near his front door and killed him. The order came from the young boss who controlled that district, Giuseppe Graviano. Years later, the Catholic Church would recognize Puglisi as a martyr, killed for his faith. The man who had him murdered is alive today, sealed inside an Italian cell. Graviano was born in 1963 in Brancaccio, the same Palermo neighborhood he would come to rule, and he rose fast. Together with his brothers, he controlled the entire district and, while still a young man, took a seat on the secret ruling body that governed the Sicilian Mafia. He carried an oddly gentle nickname, Madre Natura, a reference to his looks that sat strangely on a man responsible for so much death. By the early 1990s, he was one of the most important figures in the war faction of the organization, trusted by the leadership with its most extreme operations. That trust turned him into the director of a terror campaign. After the boss of bosses was captured at the start of 1993, the leadership that remained decided to carry their war against the Italian state onto the mainland, reasoning that if they could not win in Sicily, they would make the rest of the country bleed until the government backed away from its crackdown. Graviano became the operational mind behind that campaign. Across 1993, bombs went off in Rome, in Milan, and in Florence. The blast in Florence struck near one of the most famous art museums in the world, killing civilians in nearby apartments and damaging works of art that belonged to the cultural heritage of the entire nation. 10 people died across the attacks. The targets were chosen for shock. The organization was attacking tourists, families, and priceless paintings in order to send a message to politicians. It is worth sitting with how far this went beyond anything in the world the film preserved. The American crews killed informants, rivals, and the occasional unlucky associate. Graviano ordered the murder of a priest who was saving children, and he directed the bombing of his own country's monuments to force a government to negotiate. He was also among the bosses tied to the assassinations of the 2 anti-mafia prosecutors, whose deaths shocked Italy the year before. This was not organized crime as the movies present it. It was an organization waging open war on a democratic state and on the symbols of its time, civilization. The end of his freedom came at the start of 1994, when police captured him and his brother in a restaurant in Milan after a stretch on the run. He was convicted of belonging to the Mafia and of multiple murders, and he was given several life sentences. Like the other survivors of that war, he was placed under the hard prison regime, built to cut bosses off from the outside world. And he has now lived under it for more than 30 years. Few prisoners have fought it as relentlessly as he has. He has filed dozens of legal challenges trying to escape the regime, an extraordinary number of appeals over the years, and the courts have rejected nearly all of them, fining him each time he tries. As recently as 2025, the country's highest court, again, refused to let him out of the hard prison system, confirming that he would remain sealed away. The state has decided, over and over, that this man cannot be allowed any thread back to the world outside. There is one more part of his story that has haunted Italy for years, and it has to be handled with care because it remains contested and largely unproven. A former member of Graviano's own crew, a killer named Gaspare Spatuzza, who later became a government witness, testified that Graviano had told him in the mid-1990s that the Mafia was negotiating with powerful figures in national politics, including a man who would go on to become prime minister. Graviano himself, in court appearances over the years, has made cryptic remarks that seemed to hint at secrets involving the state, while declining to spell them out. None of this has ever been established as fact, and the men named have denied it. What it gestures at, true or not, is a level of reach into the machinery of an entire nation that the small neighborhood crews of the film could never have imagined. The American mob aspired to corrupt a union, local, or a police precinct. The allegation against Graviano's organization was that it had a hand on the politics of a country. He is only in his early 60s now, younger than almost every American boss in this account, which means the man who bombed his own nation's heritage and ordered the killing of a priest may well outlive all of them inside a cell designed to make him disappear. The film gave audiences gangsters they could root for, men with a code and a kind of doomed charm. Graviano is what the organization actually produced at its highest and most dangerous level. A boss who turned terror into a political instrument and who will spend the rest of his life in a concrete box because his country decided it could never safely let him speak to anyone again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Sicilian bosses waged their war in the open, with bombs and assassinations the whole world could see. The organization that quietly grew into the most powerful of them all worked the opposite way, staying invisible while it spread across continents. Next is Pasquale Condello and the Calabrian Mafia almost no one outside Italy has ever heard of. Section 9. Pasquale Condello and the Mafia that stayed invisible. While the world fixed its attention on the bombings in Sicily and the famous families of New York, a third organization was quietly becoming the most powerful and the wealthiest of them all. It grew in Calabria, the poor and mountainous region that forms the toe of the Italian boot, a place most outsiders could not find on a map. Its name is one that almost no one beyond Italy has ever heard spoken, even now, after it has spread across continents and come to dominate the flow of cocaine into Europe. It is called the 'Ndrangheta, and the man who sat at the very top of it for a generation is locked in a cell today, his mind reportedly broken by the years of isolation. The thing that made this organization so durable was the way it was built. The 'Ndrangheta is bound together by blood. Its clans are made up of actual relatives, fathers and sons and cousins and in-laws, which means that betraying the organization is the same as betraying your own family. That structure made it almost impossible for investigators to break in, because the informants who shattered the Sicilian and American groups almost never appeared. For decades, while prosecutors and journalists and filmmakers obsessed over the louder, more visible branches of the Mafia, the Calabrians were left mostly alone, and they used that invisibility the way a quiet competitor uses a distracted market. They took over the European drug trade. They moved into legitimate business across the world. By staying in the shadows, they became the largest of them all. The man who ruled that organization was Pasquale Condello, born in 1950 in the city of Reggio Calabria. The name the underworld gave him said everything about his rank. They called him Il Supremo, the Supreme One. Italian investigators reached for a comparison from the more famous Sicilian world and called him the Provenzano of Calabria, after the boss of bosses, who had hidden from the law for 40 years. Condello had earned the title the hard way. As a young man of 24, he was one of the gunmen in the 1975 killing of a historic Calabrian boss, a murder that set off a war across the region that cost around 300 lives. A second Great War followed in the 1980s between his own clan and a rival, and the bloodshed grew so total that it consumed even people on the edges of it. One of Condello's own brothers, a man with no connection to the organization, was murdered in the course of the feud. What set Condello apart from the brutal street figures around him was where he took the organization. A prosecutor once described him as the new face of the Calabrian Mafia, a man who dealt with politicians and high finance and pushed his clans into legitimate financial circles. He ran drug smuggling and extortion and racketeering across Calabria, but his reach extended into Rome and other major cities, and his ambition was to wash the organization's money through the legal economy until the line between the criminal world and the respectable one disappeared. He was less a gangster than an executive of an invisible empire, and the empire kept growing under him. For roughly 18 years he was a fugitive, near the top of Italy's most wanted list, and the most telling fact about those years is where he spent them. He did not flee abroad or vanish into the mountains. He hid in his own city, in Reggio Calabria, the entire time, a measure of just how completely the organization controlled its home territory. The law could not touch him on his own streets. When officers finally caught up with him in 2008, they found him with the small, handwritten notes the organization used to pass instructions, the paper threads of a command structure that ran on whispers and family loyalty rather than phones that could be tapped. The Italian state did to him what it had done to the Sicilian bosses. He was convicted and given 4 life sentences, with additional decades stacked on top, and he was placed under the hard prison regime in a facility in the north of the country, far from Calabria. The date listed for the end of his sentence is the placeholder the system uses for men who will never leave a cell alive. By the accounts that have reached the public, his condition inside has deteriorated badly. He has suffered grave psychiatric illness, has refused treatment, and his family has gone years without any real news of him, the isolation regime working exactly as designed. And yet, even from inside that silence, investigators have continued to name him in their cases, a sign that the courts still regard his shadow as something to be reckoned with. The story turns the world of the film inside out. Goodfellas celebrated the loudest and most visible branch of the Mafia, the one that wore good suits and tipped doormen and held court in nightclubs, the one that wanted to be seen even as it broke the law. The organization that actually became a global power did the opposite. It made itself invisible, bound itself in blood so tightly that no one could pry it open, and quietly grew into a criminal empire that stretches across continents, while the public stares at the wrong target. Its supreme boss spent 18 years hiding in plain sight, and then disappeared into a cell so complete that even his own family cannot reach him. The Calabrian Mafia is what the American crews could only ever have dreamed of becoming, and almost everyone who has ever watched the film has no idea it exists at all. Every boss in this account belongs to organizations that the world keeps insisting are finished, relics of a century that has already ended. The most recent proof that they are still here came in a single sweeping case, in the very city the film made famous, naming members of all 5 families at once. Next, the modern Mafia, the men facing prison right now, and what the camera still refuses to show. Section 10. Still here. The Mafia. The camera won't climb. To picture a high-stakes poker game in a private room, the kind of game where the buy-in runs into 6 figures, and the players believe they are among equals. At the table sits a wealthy man who has been invited because someone vouched for him, and across from him sits a famous face, a former professional basketball champion whose mere presence makes the whole thing feel legitimate, even glamorous. The wealthy man is, by one account in the court papers, a little starstruck, eager to be in the room. What he does not know is that the shuffling machine has been rigged, that hidden cameras and special glasses are letting the other players read the backs of his cards, and that the men running the table answer up a chain of command that leads to the Mafia. He loses tens of thousands of dollars before the night is over. On October 23, 2025, federal officials in New York stood at a podium and announced that this was real, and that it had been happening across the country for years. The case they unveiled was enormous. Prosecutors described a nationwide takedown of more than 30 people across 2 connected gambling schemes, and they did not hesitate to name the organizations behind one of them. Members and associates of 4 of New York's 5 families, the Bonanno, the Gambino, the Lucchese, and the Genovese, were accused of backing rigged poker games, taking their cut of the winnings, and using force to collect the debts that piled up. The cheating relied on technology that sounds invented, including doctored card shuffling machines, tables fitted to see through the cards, and eyewear that let conspirators read markings invisible to the victims. By one estimate, the games fleeced players of close to $7 million. Famous athletes, including a Hall of Fame coach, were allegedly paid to sit at the tables as bait, dubbed face cards in the indictment, because their celebrity was the lure. The charges are allegations, and several of the accused have pleaded not guilty and are entitled to that presumption. But the picture the government painted was unmistakable. The families everyone had been told were finished were running a sophisticated fraud in the present tense. What made the case land so hard was the company the mob was keeping in it. The arrests reached into the National Basketball Association, pulling in active and former figures, and turning the story into a national sports scandal overnight. A senior official called the joint indictment extraordinarily rare. Federal authorities spoke openly about La Cosa Nostra as a current law, enforcement concern, a phrase that would have sounded like nostalgia a few years earlier. The waves of prosecutions in the 1980s and 1990s had seemed to break the five families for good. Here they were again, at the center of a front-page case, and some experts admitted the families might be more powerful than they had believed. Look closely at which families were named, and the whole essay snaps into focus. The Bonanno, the Gambino, the Lucchese, and the Genovese were all in that indictment. The only one of the five missing was the Colombo family, and the Colombo family had its entire leadership arrested just 4 years earlier, in the Union case described already. These are the same organizations that produced the men in this account. The same Lucchese family, whose boss has run things from a cell since 1992, whose underboss and acting boss are dying in prison for a murder ordered in 2013, was accused of helping rig those poker tables in 2025. The structure did not disappear when the film ended. It grew older, quieter, and more technical, and it kept earning. That is the thread running through every figure here. The story the film told stopped in 1980, in a quiet house, with a man in a bathrobe, convinced the whole world had ended. Audiences walked away believing the Mafia was a closing chapter, a fading piece of the past, dressed up in good suits and Sunday dinners. The truth was that the camera had simply stopped at the bottom of the structure and never climbed any higher. It never reached the chair at the top of the family, the one Vittorio Amuso has occupied from a prison cell for more than 30 years. It never showed Stephen Crea building a hidden tax on the city's skyline, or Matthew Madonna ordering a man shot in his car decades after the film's events. It never crossed the river to the Bonanno boss buried in a supermax, or the Colombo heir locked away before he could take the throne, or the Chicago boss sealed in a concrete box for the murders another Scorsese film made famous. It never sailed back to Sicily, to the godfathers who bombed their own country and killed a priest, or down to Calabria, to the supreme boss of the largest mafia of them all, a man hiding in plain sight for 18 years before vanishing into a cell so complete his family cannot reach him. Those men are old now. Some are in wheelchairs. Some have lost their minds to isolation. Some will be carried out of their cells. But the organizations behind them did not age with them. The 2025 indictments are the proof. While the bosses sit sealed away, a younger generation keeps the rackets running, trading hijacked trucks for rigged shuffling machines and union pension funds, collecting at gunpoint the same way their predecessors did, drawing in victims with the same promise of glamour the film sold so well. The faces change, the work does not. That is the part the camera has never been willing to show in any of the films across 35 years. The charm is real, and so is the cost. And the cost did not end when the credits rolled. It is still being paid. In federal cells from North Carolina to Colorado, in hard prison wings across Italy, and in private poker rooms where a wealthy man hands his money to a famous stranger and never sees the wire that runs from the table back to a world that was supposed to be gone. The men at the top are still in prison today. The thing they built is still out there. The story the camera flinched from is the one that never actually ended. If you enjoyed this breakdown, Make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.